The Grand Council chamber of the Galactic Confederation hung suspended in space like a crystalline teardrop, its transparent walls reflecting the light of 3 nearby suns. Ambassador Kral'thax adjusted his ceremonial robes and suppressed a snort of derision as the latest transmission from Earth played across the chamber's central holoscreen. "Look at them," he whispered to his aide, Val Moore, gesturing with one of his forearms at the human diplomatic team stumbling through their crude attempt at first contact protocol. They can barely manage interstellar travel, and they think they're ready for admission to the Confederation. Val Moore clicked his mandibles in agreement, a sound that echoed through the vast chamber. "Their translation matrix is primitive at best, Ambassador. They're still trying to communicate using basic mathematical sequences and simplified pictograms." The other members of the High Council, representing 27 of the most advanced civilizations in the known galaxy, watched with varying degrees of amusement and second-hand embarrassment as the humans continued their presentation. Their chosen ambassador, a female of their species, was gesturing enthusiastically at a series of charts and diagrams that might have impressed a young hatchling, but certainly not the assembled masters of 100,000 years of collective technological advancement. "Enough," Kral'thax finally announced, rising from his levitation pod. His bioluminescent markings flashed with barely contained frustration. "This is becoming painful to watch. Supreme Councilor Zin'tara, surely we don't need to continue this farce." The Supreme Councilor, her ancient form barely visible within her preservation field, raised one crystalline tendril for silence. "Protocol demands we give them their full allotted time, Ambassador Kral'thax. Even primitive species have rights under Confederation law." Rights? Kral'thax's secondary heart began pulsing with indignation. They're barely past their planet's first atomic age. Their cities still run on fossil fuels, for the ancestors' sake. Half their world doesn't even believe in extraterrestrial life, despite us being right here. A ripple of laughter spread through the chamber, the various species expressing amusement in their own unique ways, from subsonic rumbles to psychic bursts of mirth. The human ambassador on the screen faltered, clearly sensing the shift in mood, even through the vast distance of space. "Perhaps," drawled Council Member Zin'tara, her scaled skin shifting through patterns of barely concealed mockery. "We should send them back with some basic educational materials? Something suitable for their developmental level? I believe I have some old training modules my spawn used before their first metamorphosis." More laughter. Kral'thax felt his pride swelling. Finally, someone was talking sense. These humans needed to understand their place in the galactic hierarchy. They were children, fumbling in the dark, and their arrogance in thinking they could join the Confederation was becoming increasingly irritating. "The motion before us," Supreme Councilor Zin'tara announced, her voice cutting through the merriment, "is to formally reject Earth's petition for provisional membership and implement a standard 100-cycle quarantine period for further development. All in favor?" Kral'thax raised all 4 arms immediately, his bioluminescence pulsing with satisfaction. Around the chamber, similar gestures of agreement were made, tentacles raised, psychic agreements registered, quantum states aligned to indicate assent. The human ambassador was still talking, her words rendered into barely coherent galactic standard by their primitive translation system ... And in conclusion, "We believe that humanity has much to offer the Confederation, including our extensive historical records of..." Communication terminated, Kral'thax announced with perhaps a bit more pleasure than strictly necessary, cutting off the transmission mid-sentence. "Let them develop for another century or so. Perhaps by then they'll have at least mastered basic gravitational manipulation." As the council began to disperse, nobody noticed the strange expression that had crossed Supreme Councilor Zin'tara's face when the human had mentioned historical records. Nobody caught the subtle shift in her preservation field's resonance. And certainly nobody suspected that the next council session would change everything they thought they knew about these primitive humans. Kral'thax left the chamber feeling quite pleased with himself, already composing the formal rejection notice in his head. These humans needed to learn their place in the grand scheme of things. After all, what could such a young species possibly know that the Confederation didn't already understand 1,000 times better? He would soon learn just how wrong he was. 3 cycles later, Kral'thax was back in the council chamber, mandibles twitching with annoyance at being summoned for an emergency session. The rejection notice hadn't even been formally delivered to Earth yet, and already there were complications. "You can't be serious," he muttered, watching as a new human delegation was ushered into the communication space. This time, instead of the previous ambassador, A tall woman with striking silver hair stood at the forefront. Her presence somehow commanded attention, even through the holographic projection. Introducing Dr. Maya Winters, head of Xenolinguistics, Earth Central University, announced the protocol drone. Supreme Councilor Zin'tara's preservation field hummed with an energy Kral'thax hadn't seen in decades. Dr. Winters, you may proceed with your demonstration. The human cleared her throat and began to speak. But what emerged from her mouth wasn't the crude standard translation they'd come to expect. Instead, the chamber filled with sounds that made every council member freeze in place. Neke Talvorkath. Su Uen Meltari Exne Ved, Dr. Winters pronounced carefully, her voice carrying the perfect tonal inflections of ancient High Kavari, the sacred tongue of the first ones themselves. Kral'thax's bioluminescent patches went completely dark in shock. Val Moore dropped his data tablet, the clatter echoing through the suddenly silent chamber. Councilmember NX Tara's scales had turned pure white, a sign of extreme emotional distress in her species. Impossible, Kral'thax whispered. That language has been dead for 50,000 cycles. Even our most advanced AI systems can only reconstruct fragments. Dr. Winters continued, now reciting what was unmistakably the opening verse of the sacred codex, the foundational text of Confederation law that only existed in its original form in sealed archives. Her pronunciation was flawless, her understanding of the complex grammatical structures perfect. How demanded NX Tara, her scales now cycling through patterns of confusion and disbelief. How does this primitive species know the Holy Tongue? Dr. Winters switched smoothly to Galactic Standard. We found the texts in what you would call the Kavari ruins on Mars. Your ancestors left quite a library there before they abandoned the solar system. Humanity has been studying these documents for over 300 years, keeping them safe, preserving their wisdom. The chamber erupted in chaos. Several council members began speaking at once, their various universal translators struggling to keep up with the overlapping conversations. Psychic species were broadcasting their shock so strongly that the chamber's dampening fields had to compensate. Supreme Councilor Zin'tara's voice cut through the pandemonium. Her preservation field was practically crackling with excitement. Dr. Winters, are you saying humans have been custodians of First One knowledge all this time? Yes, Supreme Councilor Dr. Winters replied, her composure never wavering. We discovered the archives during our first Mars expedition. We realized their importance and kept them secret until we could fully understand them. We've preserved not just the language, but the complete historical and philosophical records of the first ones. Kral'thax felt his world tilting sideways. These humans, these supposedly primitive beings, had been sitting on the greatest archaeological treasure in known space for 3 centuries. Not only that, they had deciphered it, learned it, preserved it. The humans don't need basic educational materials, Supreme Councilor Zin'tara announced, a note of amusement in her ancient voice. They've been learning from the source all along. Dr. Winters, would you be willing to share your knowledge with the Confederation? That's why I'm here, Dr. Winters replied with a slight smile. But we'd prefer to do so as equals, not as a quarantined species. Kral'thax watched in stunned silence as his carefully crafted rejection notice became irrelevant. The humans hadn't just found their way to the galactic stage, they'd been preparing for it for centuries, armed with knowledge that the Confederation had thought lost forever. And they were just getting started. The council chamber's archives projection room hummed with energy as Dr. Winters prepared her presentation. Kral'thax noticed how the human moved with surprising confidence among the advanced holographic systems, as if she'd been using such technology all her life. Perhaps, he realized with growing unease, she had been. Before I begin, Dr. Winters announced, I'd like to introduce someone who can verify our claims. Admiral Zex'thar, would you join us? A tall, distinguished figure emerged from the shadows of the chamber's upper tier. Kral'thax's bioluminescent patches pulsed with recognition. Admiral Zex'thar was a legend among the Confederation's exploration fleet, known for his controversial theories about ancient civilizations. He'd vanished from public life nearly 50 cycles ago, after being ridiculed for suggesting that primitive species might be worth studying. I've spent the last 5 decades on Earth, Admiral Zex'thar announced, his translator clicking with barely contained excitement. What these humans have accomplished is nothing short of miraculous. The Admiral's presence lent immediate credibility to the humans' claims. Supreme Councilor Zin'tara's preservation field rippled with interest as Dr. Winters activated the first holographic display. Mars, 2047 by Earth calendar. Dr. Winters began. Our first manned mission to establish a permanent base on the Red Planet. The discovery was almost missed. A junior geologist noticed unusual patterns in what we thought was natural rock formation. The hologram showed human explorers in bulky environmental suits, carefully excavating what was clearly a Kavari archive chamber. Kral'thax leaned forward, his forearms gripping his seat's armrests tightly. He'd seen similar chambers in historical records, but never one so perfectly preserved. We found this, Dr. Winters continued, displaying a complex crystalline matrix that made several council members gasp. The complete codex of the first ones, preserved in quantum crystal storage. But more importantly, we found this. The hologram shifted to show a simple clay tablet, covered in what appeared to be primitive human markings alongside ancient High Kavari script. A Rosetta Stone. Val Moore whispered in disbelief. Precisely, Admiral Zex'thar confirmed. The first ones left translation keys in multiple locations around your solar system. They knew someone would eventually find them. They wanted to be understood. Dr. Winters nodded. We discovered similar tablets in Antarctica, the Gobi Desert, and at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The first ones didn't just visit Earth, they studied humanity's ancestors. They left us the tools to understand their language, scattered across our planet like breadcrumbs leading to a greater truth. But that was barely 3 centuries ago. Council member Zin'tara protested, her scales shifting through patterns of skepticism. How did you master such complex linguistic and philosophical concepts so quickly? Dr. Winters smiled. We didn't do it alone. Admiral Zex'thar wasn't the first of your kind to find us. Show them, Admiral. The hologram changed again, displaying historical footage that made Kral'thax's secondary heart skip a beat. It showed a younger Zex'thar, along with other Confederation scientists who had gone missing over the centuries, working alongside humans in a vast underground facility. Project Babel. Admiral Zex'thar explained. A joint venture between forward-thinking members of the Confederation and Earth's best minds. While the official policy was to ignore primitive species, some of us recognized the potential in humanity's dedication to preserving and understanding the past. The images showed decades of collaboration, humans and various alien species working together in secret, decoding the ancient texts, sharing knowledge, building understanding. Your own people helped us prepare for this moment, Dr. Winters continued. They saw what you couldn't, that humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology or our military might. It's our obsession with preserving and understanding history. Supreme Councilor Zin'tara's preservation field pulsed with what seemed like satisfaction. The first ones chose their custodians well, she remarked. Humanity's relatively short lifespan creates an urgency to preserve knowledge for future generations. Your species doesn't take the long view that leads to complacency. Kral'thax watched as more evidence was presented, centuries of careful study, preservation, and preparation. The humans hadn't just stumbled upon this knowledge, they'd dedicated generations to understanding it, protected it, kept it safe, until they were ready to take their place among the stars. We didn't just preserve the language, Dr. Winters concluded. We preserved the spirit of discovery that the first ones tried to instill in all their children, something that perhaps the Confederation has forgotten in its long ages of advancement. Admiral Zex'thar stepped forward. The humans aren't just ready to join the Confederation, he declared. They're ready to remind us of who we once were, when we too looked to the stars with wonder instead of superiority. Kral'thax felt a strange mixture of humiliation and hope. Everything he'd assumed about these primitives was being turned on its head. And judging by the reactions around the chamber, he wasn't the only one experiencing this revelation. The humans hadn't just preserved a dead language, they'd kept alive a spirit of exploration and collaboration that the Confederation had somehow lost along its path to greatness. And now they were offering to share it all. The next few days in the Confederation Council were absolute chaos. Kral'thax had never seen anything like it in his centuries of diplomatic service. Species that hadn't spoken to each other in millennia were suddenly forming alliances. Ancient rivalries were being set aside, all because of the humans and their remarkable discovery. This changes everything, Val Moore muttered as they watched yet another diplomatic delegation rush past their office. The 7th Conclave is demanding immediate access to the human archives. The quantum collective is offering them full trading rights. Even the hive mind synthesis wants to establish direct neural links with Earth's academic institutions. Kral'thax's bioluminescent patches flickered with stress patterns. Of course they do. Whoever allies with Earth first gets access to the most complete First One archives ever discovered. Do you know what that means? Power Val Moore replied simply. Dr. Winters sat calmly in the center of this political storm, handling meetings with various faction representatives with remarkable poise. She had turned the council chamber's waiting area into an impromptu office, and Kral'thax couldn't help but notice how she always seemed to have exactly the right piece of ancient wisdom to share with each visitor. The Crystalline Consortium is particularly interested in this passage about quantum harmonics, she was saying to a group of silicon-based beings. The first ones had theories about consciousness transfer that might be relevant to your current civil rights debate. The silicon beings vibrated with excitement, their crystalline forms refracting light in complex patterns. Another diplomatic coup for Earth, Kral'thax realized. The consortium had been blocking numerous progressive initiatives in the Council for centuries. Meanwhile, Admiral Zex'thar was working the political angles with the skill of someone who'd spent decades planning for this moment. The humans have already translated nearly 80% of the First One's legal codes, he announced to a gathering of policymakers, including several previously unknown sections about the rights of emerging civilizations. That revelation sent shockwaves through the Council's legislative division. Kral'thax watched as several of his most reliable political allies suddenly became very interested in revising their stance on primitive species. Ambassador Supreme Councilor Zin'tara's voice caught him off guard. The ancient being had approached silently in her preservation field. Your thoughts on the current situation? Kral'thax chose his words carefully. It's unprecedented, Supreme Councilor. The humans have managed to turn their perceived weakness into their greatest strength. Their status as a young species actually gives them a unique perspective on the First One's teachings. Indeed, Zin'tara's field pulsed with amusement. And perhaps that was the point all along. The First Ones didn't leave their legacy to the most advanced civilization they could find. They left it to one that would appreciate it, preserve it, and most importantly, share it. A commotion near the chamber's main entrance drew their attention. The representatives of the mechanical consensus, usually the most reserved and logical of all Confederation members, were engaged in what appeared to be a bidding war with the bio-collective over access to Earth's educational exchange program. Did you know, Dr. Winters' voice carried across the chamber, that the First Ones had a saying, knowledge grows when shared, dies when hoarded? We've prepared teaching modules for every member species of the Confederation, adapted to their specific learning styles and cultural contexts. Kral'thax felt his mandibles drop slightly. The humans hadn't just preserved the knowledge they'd already prepared to distribute it. They must have spent decades studying each Confederation species, creating customized educational programs, anticipating this very moment. Quite impressive, Val Moore commented, watching as Dr. Winters deftly managed competing diplomatic overtures from 3 different species groups. They're not just gaining allies, they're reshaping the entire balance of power in the Confederation, and doing it so smoothly that nobody seems to mind. Because they're offering something to everyone, Kral'thax realized. Military powers get access to ancient strategic texts. Scientists get technological insights. Philosophers get ethical frameworks. Politicians get legal precedents. Even the religious factions are discovering new spiritual dimensions in the First One's teachings. Supreme Councilor Zin'tara's preservation field hummed with what might have been pride. And most remarkably, they're doing it all according to the First One's own diplomatic protocols we had forgotten, but they somehow preserved. The humans aren't just holding ancient knowledge, Ambassador, they're living it. The implications hit Kral'thax like a quantum surge. Humanity wasn't just joining the Confederation, they were revolutionizing it from within, armed with the wisdom of its founders. His own dismissive attitude toward them now seemed not just wrong, but almost comically short-sighted. There's a council session starting in 10 minutes, Val Moore reminded him. The humans are proposing a complete reorganization of the diplomatic corps, based on First One principles of cultural exchange. Kral'thax straightened his robes, his bioluminescence settling into patterns of resignation and grudging respect. Well then, he said, we'd better not keep our new teachers waiting. Not everyone in the Confederation was pleased with humanity's sudden rise to prominence. A coalition of traditionalist factions, led by the notoriously conservative patriarch Nov Tal of the 7th Conclave, demanded what they called proof of worthiness before accepting humans as equals. "This is an outrage," Nov-Tal's voice boomed through the council chamber. His massive form, covered in ceremonial battle armor, dominated the speaking platform. "Are we to simply accept these upstarts based on their ability to read old documents? What of our traditions? What of the trial of ascension?" Kral'thax noticed Dr. Winters's expression shift, slightly, a subtle change that he was learning to recognize as satisfaction rather than concern. The humans had been expecting this. "The trial of ascension?" she asked, her voice carrying perfectly through the chamber. "You mean the ancient challenge described in the Fourth Codex, Section 7? The one that hasn't been invoked in 20,000 cycles?" Nov-Tal's bioluminescent patches flared with surprise. He clearly hadn't expected the human to know about this obscure tradition. "Yes," he recovered quickly. "If you know of it, then you know its significance. No species can join the upper ranks of the Confederation without passing the trial." Actually, Admiral Zex'thar interjected, "That's not entirely accurate. The original text specifies that the trial is optional," unless he paused dramatically. "Unless formally challenged by a council member of Praetor rank or higher." Dr. Winters completed the sentence. She turned to face Nov-Tal directly. "Is that what you're doing, Patriarch? Formally challenging Earth to the trial of ascension?" The chamber erupted in excited murmurs. The trial was legendary, but few living beings had ever witnessed one. It was a test of not just knowledge, but wisdom, the ability to apply the First One's teachings in practical situations. "I so challenge," Nov-Tal declared, his armor plates shifting into aggressive patterns. "Let us see if your book learning serves you in a true test of understanding." Supreme Councilor Zin'tara's preservation field pulsed with concern. "Dr. Winters, you should know that the trial can be dangerous. The psychic linkages involved have been known to overwhelm unprepared minds." "We know," Dr. Winters replied calmly. "We found detailed descriptions of the trial processes in the Mars archives. We've been practicing the meditation techniques for generations, preparing for this possibility." Val Moore clicked his mandibles in amazement. They even prepared for this. How many contingencies did these humans plan for? "All of them," apparently, Kral'thax muttered, watching as the chamber's ancient ceremonial systems began to activate. The air shimmered as psychic dampening fields dropped. The chamber's crystalline walls transformed, becoming a perfect resonance chamber for the energies that would be involved. At the center, a circle of light formed the ancient arena where consciousness would meet consciousness in a battle of wisdom and will. "The conditions of the trial are simple," Nov-Tal announced. "We will be linked psychically. I will present 3 challenges drawn from the First One's teachings. The candidate must not only answer correctly but demonstrate true understanding through action." Dr. Winters stepped into the circle of light. "And when we succeed, the traditionalist factions will drop their opposition to Earth's membership." Nov-Tal's bioluminescence pulsed with derision at her use of "when" rather than "if." "You have my word. But failure means Earth will be quarantined for 1,000 cycles." "That won't be necessary," Dr. Winters replied. She began removing her outer garments, revealing intricate patterns painted on her skin, patterns that Kral'thax recognized with shock as ancient psychic focusing sigils. "We didn't just study the First One's writings, Patriarch. We've been living their principles, incorporating their wisdom into our very civilization." The chamber's lights dimmed as the ancient energies began to build. Council members of various species leaned forward, eager to witness this historic moment. The progressive factions watched with hope, the traditionalists with skepticism, but all knew they were about to witness something unprecedented. Dr. Winters and Nov-Tal took their positions, their minds about to be linked through technologies so old they bordered on magic. The human woman showed no fear, despite facing a being whose species had been practicing psychic arts for millions of years. "Begin the trial," Supreme Councilor Zin'tara commanded. The chamber filled with light as 2 consciousnesses met in the ancient battleground of wisdom. And in that moment, everyone present realized that humanity's preparation hadn't just been thorough, it had been absolutely perfect. The aftermath of the trial left the council chamber in a state of stunned silence. Patriarch Nov-Tal lay slumped in his ceremonial armor, all 4 of his eyes wide with astonishment, while Dr. Winters stood calmly in the circle of light, barely even sweating. "That was," Nov-Tal finally managed to say, "unexpected." "Which part?" Dr. Winters asked with a slight smile. The fact that we solved the paradox of infinite recursion, demonstrated practical application of the Unity protocols, or successfully navigated the maze of ethical consequences. All of it, the patriarch admitted, his bioluminescent patches now showing patterns of respect, but especially the part where you showed us interpretations of the teachings we had never even considered. Kral'thax watched as the chamber erupted in excited discussions. The humans hadn't just passed the trial, they'd revolutionized several fundamental Confederation principles in the process. Their fresh perspective on ancient wisdom was already causing ripples through various philosophical and political factions. Well, Valmore commented dryly, at least this means the diplomatic reception should be interesting. He wasn't wrong. The celebration of Earth's formal admission to the Confederation turned into a fascinating display of cultural exchange and misunderstanding. Kral'thax found himself acting as an impromptu translator of social customs between various species. "No, honored delegate," he explained to a confused human diplomat, "the quantum collective isn't trying to insult you. Existing in 3 different temporal states simultaneously is their way of showing respect." Meanwhile, a group of hive mind representatives was causing considerable confusion by attempting to participate in what they thought was a human bonding ritual, namely, the buffet line. They believe taking sustenance together is a sacred human tradition, Admiral Zex'thar explained, watching as the hive mind drones carefully mimicked humans loading plates with food they couldn't even eat. "They're trying to honor your customs." Dr. Winters handled it all with remarkable grace, smoothly navigating the complex web of interspecies protocols while gently correcting misconceptions about human culture. "No, Supreme Councilor," she said at one point, "not all humans communicate through this Twitter phenomenon. That's more of a peculiar cultural experiment." But it was during the formal signing ceremony that the biggest revelation came to light. As Dr. Winters approached the ancient ceremonial documentation matrix, Supreme Councilor Zin'tara's preservation field suddenly pulsed with an intense light. Of course, the ancient being whispered, "Now I understand why they chose your world." The chamber fell silent as everyone turned to the Supreme Councilor. Even Dr. Winters paused, stylus hovering over the quantum-encoded treaty. "The first ones didn't just leave their knowledge on Earth by chance," Zin'tara continued. "They saw something in humanity's ancestors, a particular combination of traits: curiosity, determination, and most importantly, the ability to learn from the past while imagining new futures." "What are you saying?" Supreme Councilor Kral'thax asked, his bioluminescent patches pulsing with curiosity. "The genetic markers," Zin'tara replied. "They're in the human DNA. Subtle changes, introduced over millennia. The first ones didn't just study humanity's ancestors, they guided their development. They were preparing them to be not just custodians of knowledge, but its ultimate inheritors." Dr. Winters nodded slowly. "We suspected as much after we decoded the genetic archives. Humanity isn't just another species joining the Confederation. In a very real sense, we're the descendants of its founders, genetically engineered to preserve and renew their legacy. That's why the ancient language felt so natural to us," she continued. "Why the teachings resonated so deeply. The first ones literally built the capacity to understand them into our DNA." Kral'thax felt his world shift once again. The species they dismissed as primitives were, in fact, the chosen heirs of the first ones themselves. The humans hadn't just preserved the ancient knowledge, they were literally born to revitalize it. "Well," Valmore said after a long moment of stunned silence, "I suppose this means the upcoming council sessions are going to be even more interesting than usual." "Indeed," Dr. Winters agreed, finally signing the treaty with a flourish. "But first, I believe we should address the fact that the hive mind synthesis is still trying to figure out how to eat soup without a physical digestive system." As laughter filled the chamber, Kral'thax realized that the Confederation would never be the same. And perhaps that had been the first one's plan all along, to inject new life, new perspectives, and just a bit of human chaos into their greatest creation. The humans had done more than just speak a dead language. They had brought it back to life, along with all the wisdom, wonder, and possibility it contained. And they were just getting started.